Fair Play, a novel by Pete Fisher. Chapter 22, Girl Power. New Year's Eve. The village hall was going to be packed. Bob had booked the Village Idiots. This would be their last gig. Vic was going abroad, Stu had his own business, and Jim was a journalist. After a brief, bright glittering, the band were to fizzle out, leaving Martin holding a dead sparkler. Bob had also booked Female Fiasco. They were from the Cathedral City, 4 young ladies in garish colours with ribbons and coloured clothes pegs in their hair. They all sang and played, a mix of brass and percussion. They were backed by 2 guys who were said to be the tightest drum and bass team in the county. Martin had watched as they ran through a couple of songs that afternoon. He was impressed. It was another crazy night at the village hall. The smell of real beer and country weed filled the air. The place was packed, bulging with locals and quite a crowd from the city. Word had spread of these way-out nights, way out in the country. Female Fiasco delivered a storming set. It sounded really good. They brought their sound guy, Joff, who had a substantial PA of his own. After their opening slot, he also did a great job for the Village Idiots. They brought the house down until soon after midnight. Then they played their last encores. After the gig, Martin got talking to Sue. She played sax and did a lot of the lead vocals. She also seemed to be the spokesperson. Enjoyed that? Shame you're splitting up. Yeah, everyone's too busy. Good while it lasted. Our guitarist left a few weeks ago. Got fed up. Too many girls. Martin laughed. Sue continued. We've got some gigs in Holland in the new year. We really need guitar. Do you fancy having a go? Yeah, why not? Love to. They swapped phone numbers. The weather forecast was not good. The ship started rolling gently from side to side, not far out from the coast. It looked like being a rough one. Rachel, who sang and played percussion, had sat next to Martin on the way there in the minibus. They got on well. They sat together again in the ferry bar. She strongly advised him to drink gin and tonic. The quinine in the tonic is a good remedy for seasickness. The gin tastes nice. Martin followed her advice. They both knocked back several in a fairly short space of time. An hour or so into the voyage, the ship began to pitch and roll dramatically. On Rachel's advice, Martin didn't look out of the window. Helpless passengers trying to walk in a straight line were being thrown suddenly sideways. People were struggling to transport trays of drinks from the bar back to their seats. A few unfortunate individuals were throwing up violently in a corner. As the hours went by, the lounge bar became a scene of devastation. Martin felt fine, just very drunk. He and Rachel fell fast asleep as the ship rocked like kids in a cradle. Martin rested his head on Rachel's shoulder. Dawn broke. The North Sea regained its temper. They approached the mainland and docked. Joff fired up the minibus and joined the queue of cars exiting the ferry. They passed through the huge open jaws of the hold. They ascended the ramp into daylight, continuing towards the custom check. Joff hadn't bothered with a carnet. They waved him into their customs shed. Everyone had to grab their passports and personal belongings and get out. The van and the gear were impounded. The customs officers gave Joff a card with a phone number he could call later. It looked like the gig that night might not happen. Female Fiasco weren't giving up that easily. They got the bus into Den Haag and found the club. It turned out to be a squat. There was a cafe bar downstairs with rooms upstairs. They could stay the night on a choice of dirty mattresses. After they'd hung around most of the afternoon, Joff called the customs office. He was told he could pick up the minibus. At the port, he was told that the officers that morning had been having a laugh. The band unloaded and set up in the cafe bar. Joff rigged up the mics from the house PA. At the gig later that evening, Martin had his eye on a sassy Dutch blonde. While they were packing up their gear afterwards, she came up and spoke to him and Noel, the drummer. "Hey, that was really cool. Not many good bands playing here. You boys tired, or would you like to go for a drink?" Noel jumped in. "Thanks, we'd love to. I'm Annika." Annika drove a bright red VW Beetle. The three of them whizzed through the drab outskirts into the clean-swept centre of town. Annika parked up outside a rather swish-looking disco. Not being much of a dancer, Martin was unsure about this at first. Noel G'd him up. They followed Annika, who was obviously a regular. The bouncer waved them in nonchalantly. Annika got them both a cocktail of her choice. It tasted delicious, but it was lethal. She fished a joint from her handbag. The three of them passed it around discreetly. Pretty soon Martin was feeling more relaxed. He excused himself briefly and went to the gentleman's cloakroom. As he entered, he saw a man with a floral shirt that had the biggest collar he'd ever seen. It was tucked into high-waisted disco flares that almost concealed his pointy white leather lace-up shoes. He was doing what looked like a line of cocaine on the marble surface next to one of the wash basins. He looked up and grinned. "You want one, my friend?" Martin hesitated. Then he thought, why not? Sure, thanks a lot, mate." The guy put out another line and handed in the banknote. Martin duly snorted what turned out to be first-class marching powder. He thanked his newfound friend and went back into the club. Noel and Annika were cutting a rug on the dance floor. Martin joined them, bolstered by his close encounter. Quite the disco daredevil, he pulled a few unusually confident moves. He'd hoped to impress Annika, but she just flashed a grin of amusement. It was getting late. Annika said they ought to go, as she had to work the next day. She suggested they stay at her place. It was a short walk away. She'd drive them back to the hippie club in the morning. The boys both nodded drunkenly. The three of them walked unsteadily along the couple of blocks to Annika's apartment. Annika put some music on and fixed a last round of cocktails in the kitchen. To round things off, she built a large goodnight spliff. Martin sensed the sunlight piercing the Venetian blinds and penetrating his tender head. He was lying in the hammock, suspended from the living room ceiling. It swayed gently in the breeze coming from the tilted open windows. He dozed off again. There were noises in the kitchen. The delicious smell of coffee and bacon wafted into the room. Annika came in, looking adorable in her flimsy bathrobe. Noel had been snoring gently on the sofa. He opened one eye and squinted at the coffee cup on the glass table. Annika disappeared again into the kitchen. She returned a few minutes later with a huge breakfast tray fit for a king. In fact, for a queen and 2 kings. They all tucked in as if they hadn't eaten for days. Martin felt his hangover slowly dissipate and fade away. He lit a cigarette to go with his 3rd cup of coffee. Life was sweet. Annika drove them back to the cafe bar. Joff and the rest of the band were waiting impatiently to set off for Amsterdam. Martin promised to send her a postcard when he got home. The next gig was a big step. They were booked to support at one of Amsterdam's most prestigious music venues. Set in a former church, it had spectacular stained glass upper windows and a huge stage. Female Fiasco shared the dressing room with the main act. They treated their support band with arrogant disdain. Martin felt nervous. The set was mercifully short and sweet. The next night's venue was also in the Diamond City, a few streets away. It was a smaller, less glamorous but no less legendary club. Female Fiasco were on equal billing with a local band. The club could squeeze in around 1,000 people, but that night there were probably only 300 or 400. The floor was covered in tatty old Persian carpets. The walls were papered with past posters. The fragrant smell of hash and weed filled the air. There were tables set out at the back of the dance floor, lending something of a cabaret flavour. A team of attractive young Dutch ladies circulated the crowd, each with a shoulder tray, like the ice cream vendors in the cinema when Martin was a kid. Instead of ice cream, they had a selection of the finest marijuana. You could also buy papers, cigarettes, tobacco and matches. Service with a smile. Female Fiasco played a longer set that night, sounding better than ever to Martin's ears. The big city audience seemed subdued and hard to impress. They were constantly spoon-fed with top bands every weekend. The next day, Joff drove them for about an hour's journey north, where Female Fiasco were booked to play at a youth centre. They spent the afternoon enjoying the cheese market, the old buildings and the canals. In fact, they were all looking forward to getting home. Tour fatigue had set in. The novelty of being on the road had worn off. The gig was a bit of a letdown, as only around 70 or 80 kids showed up. After another night in a hostel, they got the midday ferry. They were back on home turf that evening. Not surprisingly, the English customs zoomed in on the rental bus and waved them to the side. Everyone had to get out and empty their belongings onto a line of wooden tables for inspection. Toothpaste tubes were squeezed empty, makeup, face powder and hand cream scrutinised, shampoo poured out and tampons dissected. Martin had to take each individual spare guitar string out of its packet and unravel it. They searched every nook and cranny, removing some of the seats and inspecting the bus underneath from a pit. After almost 2 hours, the customs officer let the band pack their stuff away again and continue their journey home. For about 18 months, Martin enjoyed the gigs with Female Fiasco. He really liked most of the music Female Fiasco wrote. But the new songs were different now. It wasn't really what he wanted to be playing. He decided to quit and began to look around for an alternative.